Hi, I'm Paul Guppy with the Washington Policy Center, and this is our regular update that we send out to our members across the state to let them know what legislative issues that we've been working on and also what other projects and issues that we have coming up. So this time, the update is a little bit different because the legislature has adjourned for their regular 60-day session that they hold in even numbered years. So next year in 2023, they will have a 90-day session in order to write a new budget. But this was meant to be a short session in order to provide adjustments to the current budget and maybe make some program changes. Of course, it never really turns out that way. Instead, the Democrats in the legislature passed major legislation, added new spending, and tackled a whole range of issues that will affect everyone in the state in the coming year, and in fact, the years to come. So the legislature did wrap up a little over a week ago on January 10th. And now we are seeing what the results of all those bills and debates are. Washington Policy Center had a number of policy victories that we're very proud of. Our staff was engaged every day, every hour of every day. The legislature meets on Sundays, they meet on holidays, they just go right through, and we were engaged with lawmakers, meetings, testimonies, committee action, all the way through. And as I mentioned, we had a number of wins, which I have covered in other videos. For this one, because it's a wrap up, I've been asked, what kind of issues coming out of the session will affect or might be debated in campaigns and in the election later this year. 2022 is a key mid-year election coming up, both nationally and also in our state. So I thought I'd give a rundown of what issues we see coming up that will be connected to election campaigns that we can expect later in the summer and going into the fall. So first, to back up a bit, the Democrats have a majority in the state legislature. They've held that for a number of terms now. And of course, our governor, Jay Inslee, is a Democrat as well. So Washington is a trifecta state where Senate, House, and governorship are held by one party. In our case, Democrats hold a 57-41 majority in the House and a 29-20 majority in the Senate. But national polls are showing that the generic ballot is favoring the Republicans. And of course, again, nationally, Republicans in Congress are expecting a big wave, and that's kind of been built in. The polls are showing that the generic ballot shows Republicans with a plus 4% approval among voters. Now, that always has to be taken with a grain of salt, because it's one thing to ask people about party identity, who do you plan to vote for? But when there's a particular name on the ballot, voters will make a different choice. So that advantage for Republicans is not necessarily guaranteed. The other element there with the generic ballot is that all analysts and pundits know that there is a built-in bias with those ballots, with those polls that tend to favor Democrats. So if the generic ballot is tied, it probably means Republicans are ahead. If Republicans are shown to be 4 percentage points ahead the way they are now, it probably means that Republicans are really more like 8 or 9 points ahead. So that is a big wave or movement for the Republicans nationally. But what does that mean for Washington state? Well, as you would expect, Republican leaders in the legislature are very confident that they will do well, that they will gain seats and possibly even take the majority in either the House or the Senate. That's a great speculation, but as independent analysts, what we look at is the track record, and national waves have passed by Washington state in the past, particularly in 2010. Republicans took Congress, did very well nationally, but not in Washington state. And the same happened in 2014. Big national wave, but we didn't necessarily see it here in Washington state. So in 2022, Republicans look like they're going to do well nationally, but we're not sure whether that effect will be seen much in Washington state. We'll have to see. Now, there is a more optimistic view, which is that 2022 will be more like 1994, in which Republicans in Washington did do very well and took the majority of the legislature. So we'll see how that dynamic comes out. In the meantime, on specific issues, which is what the Policy Center follows, we don't get involved in campaigns, but we do track policy ideas. Coming out of the legislature, there are a range of ideas and controversial issues that we think are going to be debated as we get into election season. And I'll just run down those. And this is due to either new regulations or actions, taxes taken by the legislature, or the lack of action on key reform areas. The first one is they did not pass any emergency powers reform. So Governor Inslee is entering his third year of governing the state using emergency powers. There was a bill to modestly reform that. It came up at 1 o'clock in the morning. It was debated for 30 minutes, and then the leadership pulled it and the bill died. So there was no emergency reform was passed. Also, the state has an $11 billion tax surplus. There were a number of bills to provide tax relief. They all failed. So there was no broad-based tax relief passed in our state. Almost Jason on our staff did an analysis of all other states and found that both in Democratic states and Republican states, they passed some form of tax relief because of the economy, because of inflation getting worse. That did not happen in our state. The next issue is high gas prices, which of course are affecting everyone. There are world conditions that affect that, but particularly in our state, new climate change regulations, cap and trade, low carbon fuel standard. These are all programs that have just been passed recently. A $16 billion transportation package that includes new taxes and fees. These are all being layered on top of whatever is happening with global conditions and with inflation. So you will hear that gas prices are going up because of factors that nobody can control. That's partly true, but it's also true that policy choices in our state have added even more inflation and cost to the price of gas and the general cost of living. Another issue is the long-term care program, which the Democrats delayed for 18 months. That was a recognition of how unpopular that program is. The bill they passed to delay it puts it past the next election. I think they're hoping the issue would just kind of go to sleep for a while and then they can deal with it later. But voters have not forgotten, and this payroll tax is a high tax, and so that may be an issue that's debated in the election as well. Next is the ongoing decades-long effort to impose a state income tax. We had a major victory in court showing that the current tax that they've enacted is unconstitutional. It may be struck down by the courts, but that doesn't make the issue go away. So the radical left has indicated that they are determined to make Washington state a state with an income tax, joining 42 other states that have the same policy. Ironically, we've noticed some states are beginning to repeal their state income taxes because it puts them at a competitive advantage. So that issue is still very much alive. And then finally, there are just ongoing concerns about critical race theory being taught in the schools. Jay Inslee signed 4 critical race theory bills in May of 2021. Those are being implemented now, which require CRT to be taught in medical schools, public universities, and elementary and public high schools. So there's been a pushback from parents about that. It continues to be controversial. And kind of layered on top of that is coming out of 2 years of school closures, masking requirements on children. A lot of that is being resolved, but there's still lingering concern that this was imposed on children and what the long-term developmental and learning delay effects are. And then again, part of that same program that was done under emergency powers by the governor is the vaccine mandate, which resulted in hundreds of employees being fired because for whatever reason they didn't comply with the mandate or they didn't get a religious exemption. So hundreds or thousands even of state workers have been fired, lost their jobs, and we don't see any indication that that is being forgiven. These folks appear to be out of work permanently, and the state won't hire them back. Interestingly, in Oregon, when the governor stopped her vaccine mandate, she specifically said that state workers who had been fired would be eligible to be fired back, to be hired back by Oregon State. We're not seeing that in Washington State. So those are all issues that we think are going to be coming up. There's a kind of natural dynamic here, which again, as analysts, we would expect, and that is that Washington has been subject to one-party rule for a number of decades. We are the longest state in the country that has been governed by a Democratic governor over 40 years now. So there's just a natural tendency that when one group is in charge for a long time, there's going to be a buildup of issues that are not addressed, reforms that don't pass, or maybe an activist agenda that ends up being pushed too far and kind of leaves the public behind. So there's a sense that people feel that the legislature is not really listening to them. There were calls for a special session during the COVID crisis. The Democrats never called a special session. They left it all up to the governor. So there's a sense that the elected representatives are not accurately conveying the concerns of the people to the governor, to the state government, and that there's just a lack of balance in how the legislature is working. We'll see how that all plays out, and we'll continue to track it. In the meantime, of course, we want to thank our supporters all across the state. Particularly our top supporters, members of our Pillar Society. We just had a great event in Palm Springs for Pillar Society members. We have another one coming up in Scottsdale, Arizona, that's being hosted by one of our board members. That should be a lot of fun. The other exciting news we have is a new president is coming on board, Mike Gallagher, who was a former chief of staff in Congress, worked for a Washington state congressman, and was a longtime director of the Entertainment Software Association in Washington, D.C. He's very familiar with running large nonprofits, and he is motivated and excited to come on board and provide our new president. We think that will be great. And then we're looking forward to our young professionals program is having their book club is meeting. They also have a social hour plan coming up. We are returning to live events, which are a lot of fun. And our big excitement is for our speakers, Secretary Pompeo and Tulsi Gabbard will be speaking at our fall dinners in Bellevue and in Seattle. So we encourage you to check that out and attend if you can. And with that, I'll be back in the future with another update. Thank you.